Imagine picking up a calendar. Not an old one, not a damaged one, just a regular calendar. And as you turn through the pages, you begin to notice something strange. Certain days are blank. Not blank because nothing happened. Blank because there is simply no record of what did happen. No entry. No note. No explanation. Just silence where information should be. Now imagine that this is not one calendar. It is the collective historical record of an entire nation. And the blank spaces do not add up to a few missing days or a few missing weeks. They add up to 323 days. Nearly a full year. Gone, not from memory exactly, but from the documented, verifiable, official record of American history. This is the question that sits at the center of what we are going to examine. Not a year defined by war or famine or disease. Not a dramatic period that everyone knows was chaotic and difficult to record. Just ordinary time. Time that should have been captured, filed, cataloged, and preserved, that somehow was not, or perhaps was, and then disappeared. The difference between those two possibilities matters more than it might seem at first. Most people, when they think about historical gaps, assume the explanation is simple. Things get lost. Paper burns. Floods destroy archives. Organizations collapse and records with them. This is all true, and none of it is disputed. But those explanations tend to work best when the gaps are irregular, random, scattered, unpredictable. What makes the 323-day figure worth examining is that it does not appear to be entirely random. And that is where the simple explanations begin to feel incomplete. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what kind of nation the United States actually is, in terms of its relationship to documentation. From its earliest political foundations, America placed a significant emphasis on the written record. The Constitution itself is a document. The Bill of Rights is a document. The legal and governmental frameworks that shaped the country were built on the idea that things must be written down, witnessed, signed, and preserved. This was not an accident. The founders had specific reasons for wanting documentation. They had lived under a system where power operated without accountability, and they believed that writing things down was one of the most reliable checks against that kind of unchecked authority. Given that foundation, the existence of 323 unaccounted days raises a question that feels slightly uncomfortable to ask directly. If documentation was so central to how this country was designed, how does a nation built on written records end up with nearly a year of missing time? And more specifically, who noticed? Because the 323-day figure did not appear by chance. Someone, at some point, sat down with the records and identified the gaps. That act of identification implies careful analysis. It implies cross-referencing. It implies that someone had access to enough of the existing record to recognize what was absent from it. That process of recognition is itself worth pausing on. You cannot identify a missing document if you had no reason to expect it existed in the first place. The gaps that make up the 323 days are not gaps in empty space. They are gaps in sequences, places where the historical record clearly expects a document to exist because other documents reference it, because the context demands it, because the logic of what came before and what came after requires something to have happened in between. And in those places, there is nothing, or at least, nothing that has been made available for examination. This raises questions that the official accounts have not fully resolved. The most common institutional response to questions about missing records is to point toward the imperfections of early American administration. And those imperfections were real. The federal government in its early decades was genuinely disorganized in many respects. States operated with significant independence. Territories were even more loosely managed. There was no single, centralized system for collecting and preserving national records until well into the 20th century. The National Archives, as a formal institution, was not even established until 1934. For more than 140 years before that, documents were stored in individual departments with inconsistent standards and no unified oversight. This background is important. It provides a genuine, historically grounded framework for understanding why gaps exist. But it does not fully explain the specific nature of the gaps that make up the 323-day figure. Because some of those gaps occur in periods that were, by every other measure, very well documented. Periods where newspapers were printing daily, where the federal government had expanded its bureaucratic reach considerably, where private correspondence, commercial records, and legal filings survive in large quantities. The existence of extensive documentation in these periods makes the specific absences harder to attribute to general administrative weakness. At first, it seems like a reasonable explanation, but there is a problem. The gaps do not behave the way random loss would suggest they should. Random loss produces a certain kind of pattern. It is distributed unevenly, but without obvious logic. You lose a courthouse record here because of a fire. You lose a department correspondence there because of flooding. You lose a personal archive because a family moved and discarded old papers. These are real, documented explanations for real, documented losses. But the gaps that comprise the 323 days appear to cluster. They concentrate in specific types of records: land transfers, financial correspondence, territorial court proceedings, and certain categories of census supplementary material. When absences cluster in this way, the simple explanation of random loss becomes harder to apply confidently. Some historians who have looked at this clustering suggest it may reflect a kind of informal selection process, not necessarily deliberate, but not entirely random either. Throughout the 19th century, it was a documented and legal practice for administrative officials to make decisions about which records to retain and which to discard. Storage space was limited, paper was expensive, and the judgments about what mattered enough to keep were made by individual people with individual priorities. If those individuals consistently decided that certain categories of documentation were less worth preserving, that could produce exactly the kind of clustering that researchers have identified. This would not require any central conspiracy or coordinated effort. It would simply require that a set of common assumptions about what was valuable led to common choices about what was discarded. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the practice of administrative discarding was itself supposed to be documented. When officials decided to destroy or discard records, they were generally expected to create some record of that decision, a log, a notation, some indication that a specific category of material had been reviewed and deemed unnecessary. In the cases that make up the 323-day gap, those secondary records, the records of what was discarded, are often also absent, which creates a logical difficulty. If the documents were lost by accident, that is one explanation. If they were discarded intentionally, there should be evidence of that decision. And if neither explanation is present, the question of what actually happened becomes genuinely difficult to answer. It is important to be clear here about what this means and what it does not mean. The absence of a clear explanation is not the same as evidence that something deliberate occurred. Absences are, almost by definition, the hardest kind of historical evidence to interpret. When something is not there, it is much more difficult to say why it is not there than it would be to examine something that survived and study its contents. The honest position is one of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes the 323-day figure worth continued attention, rather than settled dismissal. What is perhaps most striking about this topic is not the gaps themselves, but the relative quiet surrounding them. In a country with robust academic institutions, significant archival resources, and a strong tradition of investigative journalism, one might expect that a figure like 323 missing days from the national record would generate sustained, organized inquiry, funded research, congressional attention, a dedicated effort to understand, as specifically as possible, what is missing and why. That kind of effort has not clearly materialized in any visible, sustained form, whether that reflects genuine institutional indifference, a judgment that the gaps are simply not significant enough to warrant the effort, or something less straightforward. That is a question that does not have a clean answer. What can be said with some confidence is this: the 323-day figure did not emerge from rumor or speculation. It emerged from the kind of careful, methodical examination of historical records that produces numbers instead of impressions. Someone counted. Someone compared what exists with what should exist and arrived at a specific accounting of the difference. That process requires access, patience, and a certain level of systematic thinking. And the result of that process, this specific number, attached to this specific nation, raises questions that the standard explanations have not yet fully resolved. The question of how a well-documented, archive-conscious country ends up with nearly a year of unaccounted time is not a simple one. It does not have a single answer that satisfies all of the available evidence. It sits in a space between the plausible and the puzzling, between what can be explained and what has not yet been explained. And that space, uncomfortable as it is exactly where this investigation begins. Not with conclusions, not with certainties, but with the question itself, patient, persistent, and so far unanswered. When researchers first began asking questions about the 323 missing days, the response they receive from official institutions is usually calm and measured. There is no alarm. There is no defensiveness. Instead, there is a kind of patient, practiced explanation that positions the gaps as entirely normal, as something that anyone familiar with the history of American record-keeping would expect to find. The explanation is clear. It is reasonable, and it is delivered with the quiet confidence of people who have thought about this question before and consider it already answered. The core of that explanation begins with a simple physical reality. Before computers, before digital storage, before centralized databases and cloud systems, every document that existed had to exist somewhere specific. It had to be written on paper, stored in a physical location, and maintained by human beings who had other responsibilities and limited resources. This was true everywhere in the world, but it was especially true in early America, where the distances were vast and the administrative infrastructure was thin. A courthouse in rural Georgia operated in near-complete isolation from a federal office in Philadelphia. A territorial administrator in what would eventually become Ohio had no reliable, regular connection to the growing federal government forming along the eastern seaboard. Records were local because everything was local. There was no other option. Understanding this physical reality is important because it reframes the question of missing records entirely. The official explanation does not treat the gaps as a problem to be solved. It treats them as a predictable outcome of circumstances that could not have produced anything different. A young nation, managing enormous distances, operating with minimal administrative coordination, and relying entirely on handwritten documents stored in buildings made of wood. Of course records were lost. Of course gaps formed. The surprising thing, from this perspective, is not that 323 days are missing. The surprising thing is that so much survived at all. This framing is not without merit. It reflects a genuine understanding of how historical records are created and preserved under difficult conditions. Historians who specialize in archival science regularly point out that the survival of any document across centuries is, in some sense, an accident. Paper is fragile. It burns easily. It deteriorates in humidity. It is eaten by insects. It gets discarded when storage space runs out, and no one with authority to object is paying attention. The fact that the United States has as many surviving records as it does, the millions of pages held in the National Archives and in state and local repositories across the country, is itself a remarkable achievement, not a baseline expectation. The National Archives, as an institution, has been direct about the incompleteness of early American records. It does not hide this. It acknowledges openly that large portions of the administrative record from the 18th and early 19th centuries are missing, fragmentary, or difficult to interpret. This acknowledgement is made in public documentation, in researcher guides, and in the responses that archivists provide to inquiries from historians and journalists. The position is not that the record is complete. The position is that what is missing was lost through ordinary, understandable processes, and that this is a shared condition among nations of similar age and development. That comparative point is one the official explanation returns to regularly. The United States is not, by any measure, exceptional in having gaps in its historical record. France has significant absences in its pre-revolutionary documentation. Much was destroyed during political upheaval. Britain has archival gaps stretching back centuries, records of local governance, ecclesiastical administration, and private commerce that simply did not survive the combination of time, fire, flood, and neglect. Russia's historical record is particularly uneven, with entire periods of administrative history poorly documented, especially outside major urban centers. If these nations, some of them with longer administrative traditions and more established archival practices, have comparable gaps, then the existence of gaps in the American record does not require any special explanation beyond the common human failure to preserve things. This is a persuasive argument. It situates the American case within a global pattern and removes the implicit suggestion that something unique or unusual must have caused the missing days. Some believe this comparative framing is the most honest and intellectually responsible way to approach the question. If every nation has archival gaps, then the existence of gaps in American records is not a mystery. It is simply a fact about the world, about how paper ages, how institutions fail, and how history is always more incomplete than it appears from a distance. For the specific figure of 323 days, the official response adds a further layer of clarification. The number is described not as a single block of missing time, but as an accumulated estimate, a rough accounting of separate gaps spread across different decades, different regions, and different categories of record. There was no single moment when 323 days disappeared. There was no event, no decision, no catastrophe that removed a contiguous stretch of the historical record. Instead, the number reflects a mathematical accumulation. A few days here from a territorial courthouse that burned in 1847. A few weeks there from a federal department whose records were transferred and partially lost in the move. Small gaps, repeated across many locations and many time periods, that add up to a larger total when someone takes the time to count them all. This framing matters because it changes how the figure feels. If 323 days vanished all at once, that would be deeply unusual and almost impossible to explain through ordinary loss. But if 323 days accumulated slowly, across more than a century of ordinary record loss, the number becomes much less alarming. It becomes, in a sense, an expected outcome, the kind of total that any researcher willing to count carefully enough would find in any large nation's historical record. The official explanation, in this way, is not just an explanation of what happened. It is also an argument about how to interpret the number itself. And this explanation is not offered carelessly. It comes with institutional weight behind it. The people who provide it are archivists, historians, and administrators who have spent careers working with historical records. They understand, better than most, how documents are created, how they are stored, how they fail, and how gaps form. When they say that the missing days are simply the result of ordinary loss, they are drawing on real expertise and real experience. This is not a casual dismissal. It is a considered professional judgment delivered by people with genuine knowledge of the subject. At first, this explanation seems to settle the matter. The country was young. The systems were weak. The distances were great. Records were lost. Other nations experienced the same thing. The 323-day figure is a rough accumulation of many small losses, not a single dramatic disappearance. Case explained. But this is where it becomes unclear, because a reasonable explanation and a complete explanation are not always the same thing. There is something in the official framing that, when examined more carefully, begins to raise quiet questions. The explanation relies heavily on general conditions, the overall weakness of early American record-keeping, the physical fragility of paper, the disorganization of pre-archival administration. These general conditions are real, but they are broad. They describe a context in which loss could happen, not a mechanism by which specific losses did happen. And when researchers begin asking for more specific accounts, not why records could have been lost in general, but why particular records from particular periods in particular categories are absent, the official explanation becomes less precise. The comparison to other nations, while valid in principle, also raises a question that the official account does not directly address. Yes, France has archival gaps. Yes, Britain and Russia have missing records. But the gaps in those countries have generally been studied with some degree of specificity. Scholars have identified, as precisely as possible, when losses occurred, under what circumstances, and what specific events caused them. The French Revolutionary destruction of certain records is a specific, documented event. The loss of British parish records to the dissolution of the monasteries is a specific, documented process. In the American case, The explanation for the 323-day gap tends to remain at the level of general conditions rather than specific mechanisms. Some believe this is simply because the research has not yet gone far enough. Others wonder whether the specifics are harder to establish than the general framework suggests. It doesn't fully make sense, for instance, that the official explanation so rarely engages with the question of secondary records, copies, references, and acknowledgments of documents that, if those documents were simply lost through ordinary processes, should still exist in some form elsewhere. When a courthouse burned, it destroyed the original records housed there. But corresponding documents, letters sent from that courthouse, receipts acknowledging materials received, references in later correspondence to earlier correspondence, often survived in other locations. These secondary traces are how historians identify that something existed even when the original is gone. In the cases that make up the 323-day total, researchers have noted that both primary records and their secondary traces are sometimes absent. The official explanation acknowledges primary loss. It is quieter about what happened to the traces. This does not mean the official explanation is wrong. It may be that the secondary traces were lost through entirely separate processes, different fires, different floods, different administrative decisions, at different times and in different places. Coincidence of that kind is not impossible. It is not even unlikely, over a long enough span of time and a large enough country. But the honest acknowledgement must be that the official explanation does not fully address this specific pattern. It explains the general shape of the problem without fully accounting for the specific texture of what is missing. What the official explanation does accomplish, with genuine credibility, is this: it establishes a baseline. It shows that record loss in American history is real, documented, and structurally understandable. It provides the intellectual framework within which any further investigation must begin. You cannot evaluate what is unusual about the missing days without first understanding what ordinary loss looks like. And the official explanation, whatever its limitations, is the most thorough account available of what ordinary loss looks like in the American archival context. Whether that ordinary framework is sufficient to explain all 323 days, whether every gap fits neatly within the boundaries of what accidental, circumstantial loss would be expected to produce, is the question that remains open. The official explanation presents itself as complete. But some researchers who have worked with these records closely are not entirely convinced that completeness has been achieved. And that gap between official confidence and investigative uncertainty is where the next questions begin to form. The official explanation is calm. It is institutional. It is backed by the authority of professional historians and archival scientists who have spent their careers studying exactly this kind of problem. And for a while, when you first encounter it, it feels sufficient. It answers the question at a general level. Records were lost. Systems were weak. A young nation managing impossible distances and limited resources could not preserve everything. That is true. That is documented. That is real. But then something shifts. Because when you move past the general explanation and begin looking at the specific gaps, not records lost in broad categories, but particular absences in particular periods, the comfortable logic of the official account begins to develop small cracks. Not dramatic breaks. Not obvious contradictions. Just quiet places where the explanation does not quite reach the question being asked. And one of the first and most significant of those places involves timing. The official explanation leans heavily on the conditions of early America, the colonial period, the post-revolutionary decades, the early 19th century, when the federal government was still finding its shape and administrative systems were genuinely primitive. In that context, missing records make complete sense. The infrastructure did not exist to preserve everything. No one disputes this. But the 323-day gap does not confine itself to those early, poorly organized periods. Some of the most significant and specific absences appear much later. They appear in the late 19th century, and that is where the first serious doubt begins to form. The late 19th century in America was not a period of administrative weakness. It was, in many respects, the opposite. This was the era of industrial expansion, of rapid urban growth, of a federal government that had emerged from the Civil War significantly larger and more organized than it had ever been before. The bureaucratic machinery of the United States expanded substantially in the decades following 1865. New departments were created. Existing departments grew. The volume of paperwork being produced by the federal government in this period increased at a rate that had no precedent in American history. And it was not just government records. Private industry was documenting itself in extraordinary detail. Banks kept meticulous ledgers. Railroad companies maintained vast archives of correspondence, contracts, and operational logs. Newspapers were publishing daily in dozens of cities, creating a continuous, distributed record of events as they occurred. This is the environment in which some of the identified gaps appear. Not the sparse, underorganized world of 1790 or 1820, but the information-dense world of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. A world where records were being created in enormous volume and where the systems for preserving them, while imperfect, were considerably more developed than anything that existed in the nation's first decades. This context matters, because when a gap appears in this environment, the explanation of general administrative weakness does not apply in the same way. The weakness was not general in this period. The documentation was, by almost every measure, extensive and detailed. And the detail was remarkable. Census records from the late 19th century contain not just population counts, but supplementary notes, annotations, and correspondence about methodology. Weather reporting stations across the country were generating daily logs that have survived in large quantities. Court proceedings from this period exist in transcript form in archives across the country, capturing not just verdicts, but the specific language of testimony and argument. Personal letters between government officials were preserved as a matter of routine. Scientific surveys, military dispatches, commercial contracts, all of these exist in abundance from this era. The late 19th century is, in archival terms, one of the better documented periods in American history, which makes the specific absences within it harder to explain. This is where it becomes unclear. When you examine the gaps that fall within this well-documented period, you begin to notice that they are not the kind of gaps that general administrative weakness produces. They are not entire categories of record that simply were never created. They are specific absences within categories that otherwise survived quite well. A series of congressional correspondence files is largely intact, but certain individual exchanges within those files are missing. A set of military dispatches from a particular period is mostly preserved, but specific dispatches referencing specific movements have no corresponding location records. Transactions between government departments that are referenced in surviving documents, mentioned in letters, acknowledged in receipts, cannot be located as independent records anywhere in the archive system. This is a different kind of gap. It is not the gap of a system that failed to create records. It is the gap of a system that created records, and then lost very specific ones. At first, it seems like this could still be explained by ordinary loss. Individual documents can be lost even within well-preserved collections. A single item can be misfiled, deteriorated, or separated from its context in ways that make it effectively invisible to researchers. This happens regularly in archival work, and it accounts for a significant portion of the gaps that historians encounter. But the pattern that emerges from the late 19th century gaps is harder to attribute to this kind of ordinary, individual loss, because the specific items that are missing are not random. They cluster, and the clustering is what makes the situation genuinely difficult to explain. Some researchers who have worked with these archival gaps over extended periods have noted a consistent pattern in what is absent. The missing records do not distribute evenly across all types of documentation. They concentrate in a specific set of categories. Financial transactions between federal and state bodies appear disproportionately in the missing material. Records related to land transfers, particularly in regions that were experiencing rapid development or disputed ownership during this period, show unusual gaps. Congressional correspondence connected to specific legislative moments, particularly around periods of significant policy change, contains absences that do not appear in the correspondence surrounding less consequential decisions. and records connected to military activity in certain territorial regions show gaps that their surrounding context suggests should not exist. This clustering is not, by itself, proof of anything. It is a pattern. Patterns can emerge from random processes. If you flip a coin enough times, you will occasionally get long runs of heads or tails that look meaningful but are simply the product of chance. This is a real statistical phenomenon, and it is one that historians and researchers are generally careful to account for. The fact that missing records cluster around financial decisions and land transfers could mean that those categories of record were, for some ordinary reason, more vulnerable to loss. Perhaps they were stored in a way that made them more susceptible to physical deterioration. Perhaps they were considered less important to retain than other categories and were more frequently discarded during administrative housekeeping. There are ordinary explanations available, but this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the ordinary explanations for why these specific categories might be more vulnerable to loss have not been clearly established. If financial records were stored differently from other records, that difference should itself be documented somewhere, in administrative guidelines, in department records about storage practices, in the correspondence of the officials responsible for maintaining those files. Some of that documentation exists, but it does not clearly account for the specific pattern of loss that researchers have identified. The categories that show the highest concentration of gaps are not the categories that available administrative records suggest were considered least important or most vulnerable. And that mismatch between the pattern of loss and the available explanation for that pattern is where the first doubt becomes most difficult to set aside. The official explanation, to be fair, does not engage with this pattern in any detailed way. It treats the missing records as a uniform category. Records lost through a combination of fire, flood, administrative failure, and the general fragility of paper over time. This uniform treatment may be entirely appropriate if the losses are genuinely uniform, but some historians argue that the uniform treatment is, in itself, a limitation of the official account. If losses cluster in specific categories and specific periods, then understanding those losses requires engaging with those clusters specifically, asking why those particular records, in those particular areas, at those particular times, are absent. Treating all loss as equivalent makes it impossible to ask that more specific question. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about methodology. The official explanation was built to account for the general phenomenon of archival gaps in American history. It was not built to account for the specific pattern of gaps that make up the 323-day figure. And when you apply a general explanation to a specific pattern, there will almost always be aspects of the pattern that the explanation does not reach. Whether those unreached aspects are significant or not is the question that has not been answered. Some researchers believe they are significant. They argue that the clustering of gaps around financial decisions, land transfers, and political transitions is too consistent across too many different periods and regions to be entirely explained by random or ordinary loss. They do not necessarily claim to know what produced the pattern. They simply argue that the pattern exists, that it is not random, and that it deserves more specific investigation than it has received. Others disagree. They maintain that the pattern, while visible, reflects nothing more than the ordinary circumstances of record-keeping, that financial and legal records were simply handled differently, stored differently, and therefore lost differently than other categories of documentation. What is notable is that this disagreement has not produced the kind of sustained, organized investigation that might resolve it. A comprehensive, systematic effort to map the specific gaps, to identify, as precisely as possible, which records are missing, from which periods, in which categories, and under what specific circumstances, has not been made a central priority of American archival research. Some individual scholars have done significant work in this area, but the kind of institutional commitment that would be required to produce a definitive accounting of the pattern has not materialized. This raises its own question. If the pattern is simply ordinary loss, a comprehensive investigation would confirm that and settle the matter. The absence of such an investigation does not explain the gaps, but it does leave the question about their nature genuinely open. What the first doubt establishes is not a conclusion. It establishes a problem with the existing framework. The official explanation covers the general case reasonably well. It accounts for loss in poorly organized periods through understandable mechanisms, but it does not fully account for specific absences in well-documented periods, and it does not engage with the pattern of clustering that researchers have identified in the gaps. These are not minor gaps in the explanation. They are the places where the explanation and the evidence do not perfectly align. And when an explanation and the evidence beneath it do not align, the honest response is not to accept the explanation as complete. It is to keep looking. The question of what produced these specific absences, in these specific categories, during these specific periods, remains genuinely unanswered, and that unanswered quality is what gives the first doubt its staying power. Before asking why certain records are missing, it helps to understand how those records were supposed to be created in the first place. Because the gap between what should exist and what actually exists is not just a story about loss. It is also a story about systems, how they were built, how they failed, and how the design choices made in the earliest years of a nation can shape its historical record for centuries afterward. And in the case of the United States, those early design choices were neither simple nor consistent. They were the product of a country building itself in real time, often without a clear plan, and almost always without enough resources to do the job completely. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. That year is often treated as a kind of beginning, the moment when the United States formally became a functioning governmental entity with defined structures and clear authority. But ratification did not mean that the machinery of government immediately snapped into place. The Constitution created a framework. It did not create a filing system. It established the roles of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It did not establish who was responsible for keeping records of what those branches did, where those records would be stored, or how long they needed to be preserved. Those questions were left for later, and later, in many cases, turned out to be a very long time. In the years immediately following ratification, federal record-keeping existed in a state of genuine improvisation. Each department made its own decisions. The Department of State kept its own files according to its own system. The Treasury Department maintained its accounts in its own format. The War Department preserved its correspondence in ways that were not coordinated with anything being done elsewhere in the government. There was no central authority with oversight over any of this. There was no standardized format for how documents should be organized, cataloged, or retained. And there was no institution whose specific responsibility was to collect records from across the government and preserve them in a unified, accessible form. Each department was, in effect, its own small archive, self-contained, self-managed, and disconnected from every other department doing the same thing. This fragmentation had immediate practical consequences. When officials left their positions, they sometimes took their correspondence with them. Personal letters written in an official capacity were considered, in many cases, personal property. When an official died, those letters often went with the family rather than back to the government. When departments relocated, as happened repeatedly during the early decades, particularly before Washington became the permanent capital, records were packed, moved, and sometimes lost or damaged in transit. When fires broke out, which they did with some regularity in an era of candles and wood-framed buildings, entire collections of departmental correspondence could be destroyed in a single night. And there was no backup, no secondary copy held somewhere else, no system for ensuring that what was lost could be reconstructed from materials held at another location. The Library of Congress was established in 1800, which might seem like an early step toward organized national record preservation. But its original purpose was not to serve as a national archive. It was created as a reference library for members of Congress, a place where legislators could access books and documents they needed for their work. It was not designed to collect and preserve the administrative records of the federal government. That function, if it existed at all in these early decades, was distributed across the individual departments in the fragmented way already described. The Library of Congress became, over time, an important repository for certain kinds of historical materials, but it was never the institution responsible for preserving the day-to-day administrative record of the United States government. That institution did not exist for a remarkably long time. The National Archives was not formally established until 1934. This date is worth sitting with for a moment because of what it implies. From 1788 to 1934, a period of 146 years, the United States government produced an enormous volume of administrative documentation without any single institution whose explicit purpose was to collect, organize, and preserve that documentation. For nearly a century and a half, the national record was scattered across dozens of departments, hundreds of local and state repositories, and an unknown number of private collections held by former officials and their families. The creation of the National Archives in 1934 was, in many ways, an acknowledgement that this situation had produced serious problems. But by the time the archives was created, many of those problems were already irreversible. The records that had been lost in the preceding 146 years were not going to be recovered simply because a new institution now existed to preserve what remained. This background matters for understanding why gaps exist. It provides a structural explanation, a genuine, well-documented account of the conditions under which records were created and managed during the period when many of the identified gaps formed. The explanation is not that someone deliberately removed records. It is that the systems for preserving records were genuinely inadequate for a very long time, and that inadequacy had predictable consequences. This is a reasonable and well-supported position. It accounts for a significant portion of what is missing. And any serious examination of the 323-day gap has to begin by taking this structural reality seriously. But this is where a small and persistent doubt enters the picture, because the United States was not the only nation building itself during this period, and the American experience with record preservation is not the only experience available for comparison. When you look at other nations that faced similar challenges, similar distances, similar administrative limitations, similar political and organizational uncertainty, the American record begins to look somewhat different from what the structural explanation alone would predict. Canada is one of the most relevant comparisons. It developed as a British colonial territory across a geography that, in terms of sheer scale, rivals the United States. It had vast distances between settlements. It had sparse administrative infrastructure in many regions. It had a colonial government that, like the early American federal government, operated with limited resources and imperfect coordination between different territories and administrative levels. And yet the archival record from colonial and early post-Confederation Canada is, by most assessments of historians who work in this field, notably more complete than the comparable American record. Land records, census materials, court documents, and correspondence between administrative levels have survived in greater quantity and with greater continuity than their American equivalents. The reasons for this difference are not entirely clear, and scholars debate the specific factors involved. But the difference itself is documented and acknowledged. Australia presents a similar picture. Established as a British colonial territory in the late 18th century, roughly contemporaneous with the founding of the United States, Australia produced a colonial administrative record that is, in many periods and categories, more intact than what survives from the same era in America. This is despite the physical challenges of preserving records in a distant colony with difficult climate conditions and limited resources. The British colonial administration imposed record-keeping requirements that were consistently maintained across different territories, creating a degree of uniformity and completeness that the American system, operating under very different political assumptions, did not achieve. At first, it seems like this comparison might simply reflect the difference between colonial administration, which operated under central British oversight, and the more independent American system, which explicitly rejected that kind of centralized control. And that explanation has some validity. The American founders were deeply suspicious of concentrated authority, and that suspicion extended to the idea of a centralized administrative apparatus with uniform standards and oversight. The fragmented, department-by-department approach to record-keeping was, in a sense, consistent with the broader political philosophy of the early republic. Decentralization was a feature, not a failure. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult to complete, because the consequence of that decentralization, a more fragmented and less complete historical record, was a real cost. And it is not entirely clear that this cost was anticipated, accepted, or even noticed by those who built the system. Some scholars argue that the comparison with Canada and Australia reveals something important about the American case. It suggests that the level of record loss in the United States was not simply the inevitable product of the challenges involved in managing a large, complex, newly independent nation. Other nations faced comparable challenges and managed them with measurably better archival outcomes. This does not mean the American gaps were intentional. It does not mean that anyone planned for records to be lost. But it does suggest that the cause of the gaps may be more specific, more connected to particular choices, particular practices, and particular failures, than a general reference to early administrative weakness fully captures. This is a distinction that the official explanation tends to blur. By presenting the gaps as a natural and expected consequence of early American conditions, the official account implicitly suggests that no more specific explanation is needed. The conditions were what they were. Loss was what happened under those conditions. End of explanation. But if other nations operating under similar conditions produced more complete records, then the conditions alone do not fully explain the American outcome. Something else must be part of the picture. What that something else is, whether it reflects specific administrative failures, specific political choices, specific vulnerabilities in the American system that did not exist in the same form in Canada or Australia, is a question that has not been answered with the same clarity and specificity as the general structural explanation. The honest position is that the structural background is real and important. The improvised, decentralized, under-resourced nature of early American record-keeping genuinely contributed to the gaps that exist. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or at least, what has not been fully resolved, is whether that structural background is sufficient to explain the specific pattern of loss that researchers have identified. The comparison with other settler nations introduces a doubt that the structural explanation does not dispel, and that doubt, small as it is worth carrying forward, because understanding why the American experience differed from comparable national experiences may be essential to understanding not just why records were lost in general, but why these particular records, in these particular categories, at these particular moments, are the ones that are absent from the historical record today. There is a certain point in any investigation where the comfortable explanations begin to feel less comfortable, not because new dramatic evidence suddenly appears, but because the existing evidence, examined carefully enough, begins to produce questions that the standard framework cannot cleanly answer. That point, in the examination of the 323 missing days, arrives when researchers move past the general patterns of archival loss and begin looking at specific cases, individual documents, specific correspondence, particular records that should exist, that every surrounding piece of evidence suggests did exist, and that cannot be located anywhere in the archive system. And within that specific category of absence, there is a subset of cases that stands apart from everything else. These are the cases of the dual absences, and they are the point at which the explanation of ordinary loss becomes genuinely difficult to maintain. To understand why the dual absences matter, it helps to understand how important federal correspondence actually worked during the 18th and 19th centuries. Communication across large distances was slow and unreliable. A letter sent from Washington to a territorial administrator in the West could take weeks to arrive. It could be lost on the road. It could be damaged in transit. It could arrive but be misfiled or misread. These were known risks, and the officials who managed important federal correspondence were aware of them. The solution they developed was straightforward. For documents considered significant, correspondence between departments, orders to military commanders, financial authorizations, legal instructions, copies were made at the point of creation. A clerk would copy the original letter by hand before it was sent. That copy would be retained in the originating office. The original would be dispatched, and in some cases, a second copy would also be sent through a different route to ensure that at least one version reached its destination, even if the other was lost along the way. This copying system was not informal. It was a recognized administrative practice, and evidence of it appears throughout the surviving correspondence of the period. Officials referenced their copies regularly. They cited retained duplicates when following up on correspondence they had sent. They acknowledged receiving copies of documents that had been sent to them alongside originals. The system was imperfect, It depended on the diligence of individual clerks and the consistency of individual departments, but it was real. It operated widely enough that for a large portion of important federal correspondence from this period, more than one copy was created and sent to more than one location. This is what makes the dual absences so difficult to explain through ordinary loss. When a fire destroyed a courthouse, it destroyed the records stored in that courthouse. That is straightforward. The fire is documented. The loss is documented. The records that were held there can be identified through other means, through references in surviving correspondence, through catalogs that were maintained elsewhere, through the secondary traces that any significant document tends to leave in the wider archival environment. This kind of single-location loss fits neatly into the official explanation. It is exactly the kind of thing that the general framework of accidental, circumstantial record loss predicts and accounts for. But the dual absences do not fit this framework. They represent cases where both the original document and its copy are missing, where the record held at the originating location and the record held at the receiving location have both disappeared, where every known version of a particular document, and in some cases, every reference to that document in the surrounding correspondence, is absent from the archive. For this to happen through ordinary, accidental loss, two separate loss events would need to have occurred: a fire in one location and a flood in another, perhaps, or the loss of records during two separate departmental relocations, or the deterioration of materials in two different storage environments at two different times. These things are not impossible, but when you begin to count the number of cases in which both copies of a document are missing, and when you notice that those cases cluster in specific categories and specific periods, the coincidence required by the ordinary loss explanation becomes harder to accept without question. At first, it seems reasonable to suppose that the dual absences are simply the product of chance. In a large enough collection of records, across a long enough span of time, coincidental losses at separate locations will occasionally align. Two related records will both be lost through unrelated events, and the result will look like a dual absence even though no single cause produced it. This is a statistically valid argument. Coincidence is real. Patterns that appear meaningful sometimes emerge from genuinely random processes. Researchers who work in archival science are trained to be cautious about reading significance into patterns that could be explained by probability alone. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the coincidence argument works best when the dual absences are scattered randomly across different categories and different periods. When the pattern of dual absences mirrors the same clustering that was already identified in the general pattern of missing records, when the documents that are missing in both their original and copied forms tend to be financial records, land transfer documents, and correspondence connected to moments of political transition, the coincidence argument requires something additional. It requires that the random processes producing loss at separate locations were somehow sensitive to the same categories of document. That fires and floods and deterioration and administrative carelessness all, independently, tended to affect this specific type of record more than other types. That argument is considerably harder to make. The institutional response to questions about the dual absences has not, by most accounts, been particularly illuminating. The National Archives, as a general policy, does not publicly comment on specific document absences. This is understandable in one sense. The archives holds hundreds of millions of items, and the absence of any specific item could have dozens of mundane explanations that would require significant research to establish. Commenting on every identified gap would be an impossible commitment. But the practical effect of this policy is that researchers who have identified the pattern of dual absences and brought it to the attention of official institutions have generally received responses that redirect toward the general framework of archival loss, rather than engaging with the specific cases being raised. The pattern is acknowledged as a concern worth noting. The specific cases are not directly addressed. This lack of specific engagement is not, by itself, evidence of anything problematic. Institutions have limited resources, and archival research is slow and expensive. The absence of a direct institutional response to a specific pattern of loss does not mean that the institution is concealing something. It may simply mean that the resources required to investigate the specific pattern have not been prioritized over the other demands on the institution's capacity. This is a reasonable interpretation. It is also, unfortunately, an interpretation that leaves the question about the dual absences unanswered. And unanswered questions have a way of persisting. Some researchers who have encountered the dual absences have proposed explanations that sit within the ordinary loss framework, but attempt to account for the specific pattern more precisely. One suggestion is that certain categories of document were, for administrative reasons, stored in ways that made them more vulnerable to the same kinds of loss events at separate locations. Financial records, for example, may have been stored in similar types of facilities at both originating and receiving ends, facilities that shared the same vulnerabilities, such as being located in buildings used for storage of other flammable materials. If both copies of a financial document were stored in similar conditions at both locations, similar causes could produce similar losses independently. This is a coherent argument. It does not require any form of deliberate action. It simply requires that administrative habits produced similar storage conditions in different places, with similar consequences for preservation. But there is a problem with this explanation too. If certain categories of record were routinely stored in more vulnerable conditions, that pattern of storage should itself be documented. Administrative decisions about storage, about what kinds of records went into what kinds of facilities, were the kind of operational matters that government departments did record, at least intermittently, and the surviving administrative records from the relevant periods do not clearly establish that financial correspondence and land transfer documents were systematically stored in ways that made them more vulnerable than other categories of record. The explanation is available in theory. The evidence for it, in practice, is not clearly established. This raises questions about what the dual absences actually represent. The honest answer is that no one has fully established what they represent. The pattern is documented. The cases that make it up are identified. The fact that both copies of certain documents are absent from the archive is not in dispute among the researchers who have examined these specific records. What is disputed, or more precisely, what has not been definitively resolved, is what caused this pattern and what it means. Some believe it is coincidence, extended across more cases than one might expect, but still within the range of what ordinary loss can produce. Others find the pattern too consistent, too specifically concentrated in particular categories, to be explained satisfactorily by coincidence alone. What is perhaps most notable about the dual absences is the response they tend to produce when raised in research contexts. Questions about the general pattern of archival loss in American history are treated as normal scholarly inquiries with well-established answers. Questions about the dual absences, about specific cases where both original and copy are missing, tend to produce a different kind of response. Not denial, not dismissal exactly, but a kind of careful redirection toward the general framework that does not engage with the specific pattern being raised. Researchers who have noted this redirection describe it in different ways. Some consider it simply the expected response of an institution managing limited resources and an enormous volume of inquiries. Others find it worth noting that the redirection consistently moves away from the specific and toward the general, away from the cases that do not fit the ordinary loss explanation and toward the cases that do. Whether that redirection is meaningful or simply practical is something that cannot be determined from the outside. What can be said is that the dual absences remain, as a pattern, unexplained by the official framework in any specific and satisfying way. The general explanation for archival loss in American history is available and well established. It accounts for a great deal. But the dual absences, the cases where both copies of a document are missing, where the records at separate locations disappeared through what would have to be separate and independent events, sit at the edge of what that general explanation can reach. They are documented. They are real. And they are not something the official account has yet addressed with the specificity that the pattern seems to require. Every investigation reaches a point where the accumulating details begin to feel heavier than they did at the start, not because any single piece of evidence is overwhelming on its own, but because the pieces keep arriving, and they keep pointing in the same general direction, and the explanations offered to account for them keep requiring a little more effort, a little more assumption, a little more tolerance for coincidence than felt necessary at the beginning. That point, in this investigation, arrives with Chapter 6. because this is where a specific, well-documented historical event enters the picture. An event that is not disputed, an event that is cited regularly in official historical contexts, and an event that, when placed alongside what has already been established about the pattern of missing records, raises questions that the official account does not directly address. The event is a fire. It occurred in 1973 at the National Personnel Records Center located in Overland, Missouri, near St. Louis. On July 12th of that year, a fire broke out on the 6th floor of the building and burned for several days before it was brought under control. The damage was catastrophic. An estimated 80% of Army personnel files covering service members who had served between 1912 and 1960 were destroyed. Navy records were also affected, though to a lesser degree. The files that burned represented the service histories of millions of American veterans, records of their enlistment, their training, their deployments, their medical history, their conduct, and their discharge. In a single event, an enormous portion of the American military's administrative record for nearly 5 decades was gone. The official account of the fire describes it as an accident. The building had no sprinkler system. This was a known deficiency that had been identified in prior safety assessments, but no corrective action had been taken before the fire occurred. When the fire started, it spread rapidly through floors stacked with paper records stored in cardboard boxes. By the time firefighters were able to contain it, the damage was done. The official investigation concluded that the fire was accidental in origin, likely caused by a malfunction in the building's heating and ventilation equipment. No evidence of deliberate action was found. The fire was tragic. It was preventable. And it was, according to the official record, nothing more than a catastrophic accident. This explanation has been accepted by most historians and by most institutions that deal with military archival records. The fire is a well-known event in American archival history. Veterans and their families who have tried to reconstruct service records from this period frequently encounter the consequences of it. Requests for documentation that simply cannot be fulfilled because the records no longer exist. The gap it created is enormous, and its effects continue to be felt decades later. But within the established historical framework, it is treated as a closed case, an accident, a preventable tragedy, a loss that cannot be recovered from, but one that has a clear and complete explanation. At first, that explanation seems entirely sufficient. Accidents happen. Buildings catch fire. Records are destroyed. The absence of a sprinkler system is a mundane institutional failure of exactly the kind that produces exactly this kind of outcome. There is nothing in the basic facts of the 1973 fire that demands any more complex an explanation than the one provided. And for most people who encounter this event in the context of general American history, the official account settles the matter. The records burned. They are gone. The cause was accidental. End of story. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the records destroyed in the 1973 fire were not simply military personnel files in isolation. They were military personnel files that overlapped, in significant ways, with the civilian records that had already been identified as part of the broader pattern of gaps in the American historical record. The periods most heavily affected by the fire, roughly the 1910s through the 1950s, are the same periods in which researchers examining civilian records had already identified specific and unusual absences. In other words, before the 1973 fire, civilian documentation from certain periods within this range already showed gaps that did not fit the ordinary loss explanation neatly. And then the fire removed a substantial portion of the military documentation from the same periods. The result was a double absence. Gaps in both the civilian and military record from overlapping decades. The straightforward explanation for this overlap is the one the official account implies, without directly stating. The same eras that produced weak civilian administration likely produced weak military administration. The same organizational failures that led to gaps in civilian records led to similar gaps in military records. And the same fire that destroyed military records destroyed documentation from periods that were already poorly preserved. Two categories of records, both reflecting the conditions of the same historical moment, both showing similar vulnerabilities. This is a coherent explanation. It does not require anything unusual. It simply applies the same general framework of administrative weakness and accidental loss to both categories of record simultaneously. And this explanation is not wrong. The civilian and military administrative systems of the early 20th century did share significant structural features. Both operated under similar resource constraints. Both were managing rapidly growing volumes of documentation with systems that had not kept pace with that growth. Both were subject to similar physical risks: fire, deterioration, inadequate storage. The connection between civilian administrative weakness and military administrative weakness during the same period is real and documented. It would be surprising if gaps in one category did not correspond at least loosely with gaps in the other. But the question that some researchers have raised is not whether the overlap is possible. It is whether the overlap is precise. Because there is a difference between a general correspondence, both categories show weakness in the same broad era, and a specific alignment, where the gaps in civilian records and the records destroyed in the fire tend to concentrate in the same specific decades and the same specific types of documentation. A general correspondence is exactly what the administrative weakness explanation would predict. A specific alignment is something that requires more examination, and some historians who have worked carefully with both the civilian gap data and the inventory of what was destroyed in the 1973 fire have noted that the alignment appears to be more specific than the general correspondence would produce. This is where the explanation becomes difficult to complete with the available evidence. The difficulty is partly methodological. The 1973 fire destroyed records that would be needed to fully map the overlap between civilian and military gaps. You cannot precisely measure the alignment between what was lost in the fire and what was already missing from civilian records if the fire destroyed the materials that would allow you to make that comparison. The loss creates its own investigative obstacle. Whatever the fire destroyed cannot be examined. Whatever it contained about the periods and categories already identified as problematic in civilian records cannot be recovered for analysis. The investigative path into this specific question is, in a very literal sense, blocked by the event being investigated. Some researchers find this situation simply unfortunate, a genuine obstacle created by a genuine accident that makes certain questions permanently more difficult to answer. Others find it worth noting that the fire, whatever its cause, produced exactly the kind of result that would make the most specific investigative questions about the overlap impossible to pursue. Whether that outcome is the product of chance or something else is a question that the available evidence does not answer. The official investigation found no evidence of deliberate action. That finding cannot be dismissed. But the absence of found evidence is not the same as the absence of an unanswered question. What has been established, separate from any question about the fire's cause, is a recurring pattern of absence that concentrates in specific decades and specific types of records across both civilian and military categories. This pattern was identified in the civilian record before the 1973 fire became part of the discussion. The fire added a second dimension to the pattern, a large-scale loss event that removed military documentation from the same general territory that civilian researchers had already flagged as problematic. The combination of these two things, the pre-existing civilian gaps and the fire's destruction of overlapping military records, creates a situation where certain periods of American history are now documented at significantly lower levels than the surrounding periods. Not across all categories, not uniformly, but in specific categories and specific decades. The combined effect of pre-existing civilian gaps and the 1973 military record loss has produced areas of relative darkness in the historical record. Historians who have examined this combined effect describe it in careful, measured terms. They do not characterize it as deliberate. They do not claim to know what produced the specific alignment between civilian gaps and the fire's destruction. What they do is note that the pattern exists, that it is more concentrated than random loss would predictably produce, and that the concentration raises questions that the official framework, which addresses civilian loss and the fire separately, rather than examining them in relation to each other, does not directly answer. This raises a broader question about how the official account handles the relationship between different types of archival loss. The general framework tends to treat each loss event independently. A courthouse fire is one event. A departmental relocation that damaged records is another. The 1973 fire is a third. Each is explained on its own terms, as a separate and unconnected instance of ordinary loss. But researchers who look across these separate events and notice that they tend to remove records from the same periods and the same categories are asking a different kind of question. They are asking whether the pattern of loss, taken as a whole, across all the separate events, is itself something that requires explanation. The official framework, by treating each event separately, does not engage with this pattern-level question. Whether the pattern-level question has a meaningful answer is genuinely unclear. It may be that the concentration of loss in specific decades and categories reflects nothing more than the compounding of ordinary factors, that certain periods were simply, for multiple independent reasons, more vulnerable to archival loss than others. This is a plausible explanation. It is also one that cannot be fully verified, because verifying it would require examining records that, in some cases, no longer exist. The investigation into what these patterns mean runs directly into the problem that the patterns themselves create. The more records that are missing, the harder it is to understand why they are missing. What remains, at the end of this examination, is a set of questions that the official account has not fully resolved. The overlap between civilian gaps and military record loss from the 1973 fire is real. The concentration of that overlap in specific decades and specific categories is documented. The explanation offered for it, that both categories reflect the same general conditions of administrative weakness and accidental loss, is available and coherent. But it is a general explanation applied to a specific pattern, and the specific pattern, examined carefully, raises questions that the general explanation does not reach. Those questions remain open. They have not been dismissed. They have simply not been answered. There is a particular kind of difficulty that comes with trying to study something that is defined by its absence. When you are looking for what is not there, you are working with evidence that, by its nature, cannot speak for itself. A missing document cannot tell you why it is missing. A gap in a record cannot explain how it formed. All you can do is look at the shape of the absence, at where it appears, at what surrounds it, at what kinds of records are consistently gone, and what kinds of records consistently survive, and try to understand what that shape means. This is the work that certain researchers have undertaken with the gaps that make up the 323 missing days. And what they have found, when they look carefully at the shape of the absences, is not randomness. It is pattern, repeated, concentrated, and specific enough that the question of what produced it cannot be easily set aside. Working with incomplete data is always a methodological challenge. When you are trying to map gaps in a record that is itself fragmentary, you run the risk of seeing patterns that are artifacts of the incompleteness rather than features of the underlying reality. A gap that appears to cluster in a specific region might reflect nothing more than the fact that records from that region are generally less well preserved, making any kind of gap more visible there. A concentration in a specific category of record might reflect nothing more than the fact that that category was more heavily studied, so its absences are more thoroughly documented. These are real methodological risks, and the researchers who have worked most carefully with this data acknowledge them. They have attempted to account for them. But even after accounting for the ways that incompleteness can create false patterns, something remains. The patterns persist. The first and most geographically clear pattern is the regional distribution of the gaps. When researchers plot the known absences against a map of the United States, accounting for the different states, territories, and administrative regions that existed across the relevant periods, they find that the missing records are not evenly spread. They are not randomly distributed across the country in the way that ordinary loss, produced by fires and floods and administrative carelessness acting independently across different locations, would be expected to produce. Instead, they cluster. They concentrate in specific regions, and the regions where they concentrate share a common characteristic. They are regions that experienced significant political disruption during the 19th century, areas where territorial status changed, areas where border disputes between states or between the United States and other nations produced periods of unclear jurisdiction, areas where federal land reassignment programs transferred large amounts of territory from one administrative category to another in relatively short periods of time. This geographic clustering is the clearest and most consistently documented of the three patterns that researchers have identified. It appears across different studies, conducted by different researchers, working independently with different portions of the archival record. The consistency of the finding across independent analyses gives it a degree of reliability that single-study findings do not have. Something real is producing this geographic concentration. The question is what? The administrative weakness explanation would predict some geographic variation. Regions with weaker administrative infrastructure would naturally produce more gaps, but it would not predict the specific kind of concentration in regions defined by political transition and jurisdictional instability. That particular geographic signature requires more explanation than the general framework provides. The second pattern involves the category of records that are missing, and it is in some ways more telling than the geographic pattern. When researchers examine not just where the gaps appear, but what types of records are absent, they find a consistent concentration in four specific categories. The first is land transfer documentation, records of how ownership of land changed hands through sale, grant, inheritance, or government reassignment. The second is financial correspondence between state and federal bodies, the records of how money moved between different levels of government, including appropriations, disbursements, and accounting between departments. The third is records of judicial proceedings in territorial courts, the documentation of legal decisions made in areas that were under federal territorial jurisdiction rather than full state governance. The fourth is census supplementary notes, the additional materials that accompanied the main census records and provided context, methodology, and detail about specific populations and regions. These four categories do not immediately seem to share an obvious common thread. Land records, financial correspondence, court proceedings, census notes, on the surface, they are quite different kinds of documentation. But when you look at what each of them represents in terms of its underlying function, a common theme emerges. Each of these categories is, at its core, a record of ownership and entitlement. Land transfer documents record who owns what land and on what legal basis. Financial correspondence records who controls what money and through what authorization. Territorial court records document what legal rights and obligations apply to whom in a given jurisdiction. Census supplementary notes document who is counted as part of which community, which matters for everything from representation to resource allocation. All four categories are records of who has what, and on what basis they have it. Some historians find this concentration significant, not because they claim to know what produced it, but because it raises a question that general explanation does not answer. If records were lost through ordinary, random processes, through fires and floods and administrative carelessness acting without discrimination, you would expect the losses to be distributed more evenly across different types of documentation. You would lose cultural records and military records and medical records and financial records in roughly similar proportions, adjusted for the volume in which each type was created. The fact that the gaps concentrate specifically in categories that document ownership and entitlement, and concentrate there significantly more than in categories that document culture, military activity, or general governance, is a distributional feature that requires explanation. Some believe it reflects the storage practices of the period, which may have handled certain types of records differently from others. Others are not sure that explanation fully covers the specificity of the pattern. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the third pattern that researchers have identified is harder to explain than either the geographic or categorical patterns. It involves a specific type of evidence, references in surviving documents to other documents that cannot be found. In historical correspondence, it was common practice to refer to enclosed materials. A letter would mention that it was accompanied by a report, a map, a financial accounting, or a set of instructions. The letter would describe what the enclosure contained, why it was relevant, and what action the recipient was expected to take based on it. These references serve as a kind of catalog, a record of what was sent, what was received, and what existed at a given moment in the flow of correspondence. And among the gaps in the 323 missing days, researchers have found cases where these references point to documents that are nowhere in the archive system. The letters survive. The references survive. But the materials being referenced do not. Someone wrote about these enclosures. Someone acknowledged receiving them. Someone made decisions based on what they contained. And then the documents themselves disappeared, leaving only the references as evidence that they ever existed. This is a specific and unusual type of absence. It is different from the general disappearance of records from a poorly organized period. It represents the loss of specific materials that were demonstrably received, demonstrably read, and demonstrably acted upon. Materials whose existence is confirmed by multiple independent references in surviving correspondence. At first, it seems like this too could be explained by ordinary archival processes. Documents get separated from their accompanying correspondence all the time. A letter is filed in one place, its enclosure in another, and over decades the two become disconnected in ways that make the enclosure effectively invisible to researchers. Misfiling is one of the most common causes of apparent absences in large archival collections. A document that looks missing may simply be in a different folder, under a different subject heading, in a different box or cabinet from where a researcher would expect to find it. This is a real and important caveat. Not all apparent absences are genuine absences. Some are simply mislabeled or mislocated materials that have not yet been found. But there's a problem with applying this explanation to all of the cases in this third pattern. For a misfiled document to remain effectively missing across multiple independent archival searches conducted by multiple researchers over extended periods of time, it would need to be filed in a genuinely unexpected location that none of those researchers thought to check. In large, poorly organized collections, this is certainly possible. But when the cases that make up this third pattern are examined, many of them involve collections that have been fairly thoroughly cataloged, archives where the general organizational structure is well understood, and where researchers with knowledge of that structure have specifically searched for the reference materials. The misfiling explanation is available, but its applicability to the specific cases involved is not clearly established. What makes this third pattern particularly difficult to interpret is that it provides a kind of double confirmation that the missing materials existed. The references in surviving correspondence confirm their existence at the time of creation and transmission. The absence of the materials from the archive confirms that they are not there now. The gap between those two facts, the gap between documented existence and current absence, is where the question about this pattern lives. How something that was demonstrably created, transmitted, received, and acted upon came to be entirely absent from the archival record is a question that different researchers answer in different ways. Some consider it simply the product of the ordinary processes of archival loss, extended across a large enough collection and a long enough period to produce a certain number of cases where both the document and all of its associated copies were lost. This is a coherent position. It requires accepting that loss events, over time, can occasionally combine to remove materials that were at some point well evidenced by surrounding documentation. Others find this harder to accept as a complete explanation, particularly given that this third pattern concentrates in the same categories and the same geographic regions as the first two patterns. If the three patterns were distributed independently of each other, if the reference but missing documents appeared in different categories from the other gaps and in different regions, the coincidence argument would be more straightforward. But the alignment of all three patterns, in the same categories and the same regions, is what gives the overall picture its persistent, unanswered quality. That quality, the way the patterns keep pointing in the same direction without fully resolving into an explanation, is what makes this stage of the investigation genuinely difficult. The patterns are real. They are documented. They have been identified by independent researchers, working with different portions of the same archival record. What they mean, and what produced them, remains a question that the official framework has not answered with the specificity that the patterns seem to require. And that unanswered quality is not going away simply because the question is difficult to pursue. It stays. It accumulates. And it continues to shape the investigation as it moves forward. One of the quieter realizations that comes with extended investigation is that the question you started with is rarely the right question. You begin with a number, 323 days. It feels specific. It feels like something that has been measured, counted, and established with a degree of precision that makes it a reliable foundation for inquiry. And it is, in a sense, reliable. The number was derived from careful analysis. It represents real absences in the real historical record. It is not an estimate pulled from speculation, but as the investigation deepens, a different and more unsettling realization begins to form. The number may be accurate as far as it goes. The problem is how far it actually goes. And increasingly, the evidence suggests that it does not go nearly as far as the full scope of the problem requires. To understand why the 323-day figure might underestimate the true scale of what is missing, you have to understand exactly how that figure was calculated. It was not produced by a comprehensive audit of the entire American historical record. It was produced by a specific methodology applied to a specific subset of documents. That methodology worked by identifying gaps that were visible, absences that left traces in the surrounding record. When a document is referenced in a letter, acknowledged in a receipt, cited in a later decision, or described in accompanying correspondence, its existence is established even if the document itself cannot be found. The methodology counted these cases. It identified instances where the surrounding record clearly implied that a document had existed, and where that document was absent from the archive. The total of those identified instances, converted into an estimated quantity of unrecorded time, produced the 323-day figure. This is a sound methodology for what it measures. It is systematic. It is grounded in the actual content of surviving documents. It does not rely on assumption or speculation. Every gap it counts is a gap that has been confirmed by cross-referencing real archival materials. In that sense, the 323-day figure is defensible as a floor, as a minimum estimate of what is provably missing from the record. But the word floor is important, because a floor is not the whole room. And the methodology that produced this figure has a structural limitation that is built into its design. It can only count what it can see. It can only identify absences that left traces. And there is an entire category of missing documentation that, by definition, leaves no traces, because if it existed, those traces were also removed, or because the documents were never created in the first place. Consider what it would mean for a record to be truly invisible to this methodology. If a document was created, sent, received, and acted upon, but every reference to it in surrounding correspondence was also removed. Every mention in letters, every acknowledgement in receipts, every citation in later decisions, then the methodology would have no basis for counting its absence. There would be nothing in the surviving record to indicate that the document had ever existed. The gap would be invisible. It would not appear in the 323-day figure because the figure has no way of seeing it. The absence would be real. The gap would be genuine, but it would exist entirely outside the count. This is not a hypothetical concern invented to make the problem seem larger than it is. It is a genuine methodological limitation that archival scholars acknowledge when discussing the boundaries of what any counting methodology can establish. Absence of evidence is a well-recognized problem in historical research. When you are working with an incomplete record, you can measure the incompleteness that is visible to you. You cannot measure the incompleteness that is not. The 323 days are the incompleteness that is visible. What lies beyond that visibility is, by definition, unknown. But the fact that it is unknown does not mean it is small. It means it is unmeasured. And those are very different things. Some archival scholars have given this unmeasured territory a specific name. They call it the structural blind spot, the portion of the problem that the available methodology cannot reach. The term is useful because it captures both the reality of the limitation and its origin. The blind spot is structural. It is not the result of researchers failing to look hard enough, or of the methodology being poorly designed. It is the result of a fundamental feature of how the methodology works. The fact that it depends on traces, and that some absences leave no traces. A better methodology might reduce the blind spot. A perfectly comprehensive audit of the entire surviving record, conducted systematically and at scale, might identify additional gaps that the current methodology misses. But it could never eliminate the blind spot entirely, because the cases where all references were also removed are, by their nature, invisible to any methodology that depends on the surviving record. This is where the 323-day figure begins to feel less like an answer and more like a lower boundary, a starting point rather than a conclusion. Some scholars who have worked with this limitation describe it in terms of floors and ceilings. The 323 days are the floor, the confirmed minimum, and the ceiling is unknown. The actual volume of missing time in the American historical record could be considerably larger. Not dramatically larger in the way of sensationalist claims, but meaningfully larger in ways that would matter for how the problem is understood and addressed. A problem of 323 missing days is significant, but perhaps manageable. A problem of considerably more than 323 missing days, with an unknown upper boundary, is a different kind of problem. It is one that requires a different scale of response. At first, this might seem like an abstract concern. If the additional missing records are invisible to any methodology, what practical difference does it make whether they exist or not? They cannot be recovered. They cannot be studied. Their absence cannot even be confirmed. Why does the size of the unmeasured blind spot matter if the blind spot is, by definition, inaccessible? This is a reasonable question, and there are researchers who take something close to this position, who argue that since the invisible gaps cannot be identified or studied, they should not significantly affect how the visible gaps are interpreted or addressed. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult to accept fully, because the size of the blind spot matters for how the visible gaps are understood, even if the blind spot itself cannot be directly examined. If the 323 days represent only the visible portion of a much larger problem, then the patterns identified in those 323 days, the geographic clustering, the categorical concentration, the presence of reference but missing documents, take on a different significance. They become not the full picture of what is missing, but a sample of it. And samples, in research contexts, are interpreted differently from complete populations. A pattern that appears in a sample may appear there because it genuinely characterizes the larger population, or it may appear there because of how the sample was constructed. Understanding which is true requires knowing something about the relationship between the sample and the full population. If the full population is significantly larger than the sample, that relationship becomes more important and more uncertain. The question of how to respond to this situation has produced genuine disagreement among researchers and institutions. Some scholars have petitioned, in formal and informal ways, for a broader audit of the American archival system, a systematic effort to cross-reference all surviving documents at a scale that goes beyond what individual researchers can accomplish working with specific portions of the record. Such an audit would not resolve the blind spot entirely, but it would reduce it. It would identify additional gaps that the current methodology misses by applying more comprehensive cross-referencing to a wider range of materials. It would produce a more complete picture of what is missing and where those absences cluster, and it would establish a more reliable sense of whether the 323-day figure is close to the true scale of the problem or significantly below it. These petitions have received limited institutional support. This is a fact, not an accusation. The National Archives and other institutions that would be involved in such an audit have finite resources. A comprehensive cross-referencing audit of the American historical record would be an enormous undertaking, one that would require years of work and significant funding that has not been allocated. The practical obstacles are real. They are not invented explanations designed to avoid an uncomfortable investigation. Archives are chronically underfunded relative to the scale of their holdings and the demands placed on them. A project of the kind being proposed would compete with many other urgent archival needs, and its specific value relative to those other needs has not been clearly established in institutional priority setting. But the limited support for a broader audit raises a question that is difficult to answer entirely through resource constraints. If the 323-day figure represents a confirmed floor of missing documentation, if the institutional acknowledgement is that this much is definitively gone, then understanding whether the actual scale is significantly larger would seem like a research priority worth serious institutional investment. The fact that the visible portion of the problem has been documented and discussed does not reduce the importance of understanding what lies beyond the visible portion. If anything, it increases it. The confirmation that gaps exist at the level of 323 days establishes that the problem is real. The question of how much larger the real problem is seems like a natural next step for serious institutional inquiry. The question of why that next step has not been taken more aggressively does not have a single clean answer. Some attribute it to resource constraints, which are genuine. Some attribute it to institutional inertia. The tendency of large organizations to continue doing what they have been doing rather than committing to new, large-scale projects that disrupt existing workflows and priorities. Some attribute it to a judgment that the additional gaps, even if they exist, are unlikely to change the overall understanding of the periods involved in significant ways. And some raise a different kind of question entirely, one that moves the discussion beyond archival methodology and into the territory of institutional accountability. That shift in territory is significant, because once you begin asking not just why records are missing, but why the effort to understand the full scope of what is missing has not been more aggressively supported, you are no longer asking purely a historical question. You are asking a question about how institutions manage information, about what they prioritize, what they deprioritize, and whether the boundaries of what they actively investigate correspond to the boundaries of what is actually important to understand. Those are different kinds of questions. They require different kinds of evidence, and they do not yet have clear answers. What they have is the same quality that has characterized this investigation throughout, the quality of being genuinely open, genuinely unresolved, and genuinely worth continuing to examine. There comes a point in any serious investigation where the evidence stops leading clearly in a single direction, where the accumulation of patterns, doubts, and unanswered questions does not resolve into one explanation, but instead opens into several. This is that point. The gaps have been established. The patterns have been documented. The limitations of the official framework have been examined in some detail. And now, before moving any further, it is worth stepping back and considering the full range of interpretations that serious researchers and historians have brought to this material. Because there's not one view of what the 323 missing days represent. There are several. Each of them is grounded in real reasoning. Each of them has something to recommend it. And none of them, examined carefully, fully closes the question. The first interpretation is the one that sits closest to the official account. It holds that the missing records are exactly what the institutional explanation says they are: the natural, predictable result of a young, disorganized nation that did not have the administrative systems in place to preserve everything it produced. On this view, there is nothing unusual about the 323-day figure. It is simply what archival loss looks like when you count it carefully enough in a country of this size and complexity. Any nation with a comparable history of administrative development would produce a similar number if someone sat down and counted its absences with the same methodology. The figure sounds dramatic because it is expressed in days, in units of time, which makes it feel like something was stolen. But converted back into what it actually represents, scattered documentary gaps across more than a century of history, it is, on this view, unremarkable. Proponents of this first interpretation also address the patterns that researchers have identified: the geographic clustering, the categorical concentration, the reference but missing documents, by arguing that these patterns are artifacts of selective attention rather than features of reality. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. When we look at a large, complex dataset, even a random one, we tend to find patterns. We notice the configurations that seem meaningful and ignore the configurations that don't. This is a well-documented cognitive tendency, and it applies to historical research as much as it applies to any other field of inquiry. On this view, researchers who have identified patterns in the missing records are not discovering something real about the structure of the gaps. They are imposing structure on data that is, at its core, random. The patterns feel real because researchers are looking for them. That does not mean the patterns are there in any meaningful sense. This argument is worth taking seriously. Confirmation bias is real. Pattern recognition applied to random data genuinely does produce false positives. And the researchers who have identified these patterns are not immune to the general human tendency to find what one is looking for. The first interpretation raises a legitimate methodological challenge, but it does not fully resolve the specific concerns that have been raised. The geographic clustering, for instance, was identified by multiple independent researchers working with different portions of the record. When different researchers, working independently, find the same pattern, the selective attention argument becomes harder to sustain. The pattern would have to be simultaneously visible to multiple independent observers who were each individually constructing it from random data. That is possible, but it requires more coincidence than the argument is usually prepared to acknowledge. The second interpretation does not dispute that the gaps are real. It accepts the patterns. It accepts the clustering, but it offers a different explanation for what produced them, one that does not require any form of deliberate concealment or coordination. This view holds that the gaps are the result of intentional administrative housekeeping, not conspiracy, not cover-up, just the ordinary, legal, documented practice of officials deciding that certain records had outlived their usefulness and discarding them accordingly. Throughout the 19th century, this kind of administrative housekeeping was standard practice at every level of American government. Departments operated with limited storage space. Paper accumulated at rates that storage facilities could not always accommodate. Officials were regularly faced with decisions about what to keep and what to throw away. And in most cases, those decisions were made by individuals who applied their own judgment about relevance and importance. There were no universal standards. There was no central oversight. And because the decisions were often made informally, without creating records of what was discarded and why, they left no trail. The documents were gone, and there was nothing in the archive to indicate they had ever been removed rather than simply never created. This interpretation accounts for several features of the pattern that the pure loss explanation handles less cleanly. It explains why the gaps cluster in categories that touch on ownership and entitlement, land records, financial correspondence, territorial court proceedings. These may be exactly the categories that officials at various levels considered most outdated, most likely to produce complications if retained, and therefore most appropriate for routine discarding. It explains why secondary references sometimes also disappear. If an official was thorough enough in their housekeeping, they might have removed not just the primary document, but correspondence that referenced it, reducing the paper trail around a set of transactions they considered closed. And it explains why the geographic distribution of gaps corresponds to regions of political transition, precisely the regions where administrative officials would have been most likely to conduct housekeeping as governance changed hands and new officials decided what was worth keeping from the previous administration. But this is where the second interpretation becomes difficult to maintain completely, because the administrative housekeeping explanation, while it accounts for deliberate discarding, still requires that those discarding decisions were made without any coordination, independently, by different officials in different places, applying their own individual judgment about what to remove. The result, under this interpretation, is a pattern that looks coordinated but was produced by uncoordinated individual choices that happen to converge. This is possible. Common assumptions about what was important could lead different officials to make similar decisions. But the specificity of the pattern, its concentration in very particular categories and very particular geographic regions, is harder to explain through entirely uncoordinated individual housekeeping than through some degree of shared framework for what should and should not be retained. The third interpretation takes this reasoning one step further. It suggests that some portion of the missing records, not necessarily all of them, but some, may have been deliberately removed to protect private interests, not through a central, coordinated conspiracy, not through a systematic program organized at the federal level, but through individual decisions made by people who had access to specific records and specific motivations to ensure that those records did not survive. A land deal that was legally questionable, a financial arrangement that would not withstand scrutiny, a judicial proceeding whose outcome depended on evidence that could not bear close examination. In each of these cases, someone with access to the relevant records would have had a clear incentive to ensure those records were not available to future researchers. This interpretation is the one that tends to make people most uncomfortable, because it implies something that the word deliberate carries. It implies choice. It implies agency. It implies that the gaps are not simply the product of circumstance, but of decision, that someone somewhere decided that these specific records should not exist, and that implication sits uneasily alongside the institutional framework that treats all archival loss as ordinary and circumstantial. But it is important to note what this third interpretation does not claim. It does not claim a central conspiracy. It does not claim coordination between different actors pursuing a shared agenda. It only claims that individuals in positions of access, acting on private motivations, occasionally made choices that resulted in specific records being removed. This is not a dramatic claim. It is, in fact, a relatively modest one. People in positions of access to important records have always had incentives to manage what those records show. That some of them acted on those incentives at some point, in some cases, is not a remarkable proposition. The difficulty with the third interpretation is evidentiary. Proving that a record was deliberately removed requires evidence, and the nature of deliberate removal is that it tends not to leave evidence. If someone removed a document to ensure it would not survive, they were unlikely to create a separate record documenting that removal. The absence of evidence for deliberate removal is exactly what deliberate removal would be expected to produce. This creates a logical situation where the interpretation cannot be easily confirmed or refuted by the available evidence. It remains possible. It remains plausible in specific cases, but it cannot be established definitively from what survives, which means it must be held as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The fourth interpretation takes a different approach entirely. Rather than accepting the 323-day figure as a reliable floor and debating what produced the gaps, it questions the figure itself. This view holds that the methodology used to calculate the 323 days introduced errors that make the figure unreliable as a measure of what is actually missing. The methodology depended on identifying gaps that left traces, absences that were confirmed by cross-referencing surviving documents. But this process is itself subject to error. Not every reference to a document in surviving correspondence is a reliable indicator that the document existed as described. References can be mistaken. Copies can be misidentified as originals. Documents can be found in unexpected locations that researchers failed to check. The figure of 323 days may be inflated by false positives, cases counted as gaps that are not actually gaps, but simply records that have not yet been located. This is a legitimate methodological concern. No counting methodology is error-free, and the researchers who produced the 323-day figure acknowledged this. The question is how large the error margin might be. If false positives account for a small percentage of the counted gaps, the figure remains meaningful even if not precisely accurate. If false positives account for a substantial portion, the figure becomes much less reliable as a foundation for further investigation. The fourth interpretation tends to suggest the latter, that the error margin is large enough to cast doubt on the figure's overall reliability. Proponents of this view generally do not claim that no records are missing. They claim that the specific figure of 323 days should not be treated as a reliable anchor for the investigation. Each of these four interpretations captures something real. The first is correct that administrative weakness was genuine and that pattern seeking can produce false positives. The second is correct that housekeeping discarding was a documented and common practice. The third is correct that individuals with access to records had incentives to manage them selectively. The fourth is correct that counting methodologies have error margins. None of these observations cancels the others. They can all be simultaneously true, in different proportions, for different portions of the 323-day gap. The question is not which interpretation is right. The question is what combination of these interpretations, applied to which specific cases, comes closest to explaining what actually happened. And that question remains, at this stage of the investigation, genuinely unanswered, not unexamined, not ignored, simply unresolved, held open by the same combination of real evidence and real uncertainty that has characterized this investigation throughout.